But if you were to search for, right, right. So if you were to look a couple of weeks ago on Google, you would find there was a link. When you just put LeBron James in, it would take you to a website that would ask you to install a Flash Player update. And we all know how great Flash Player updates are, and you see it in the news all the time, so you want to get the latest, greatest. So when you download that, bam. So you know what's funny is we're looking at examples of malware, and it's kind of funny because I don't really think there's any other profession where you spend a lot of time looking at like the worst case scenarios of things, except for maybe doctors. I always think that looking at malware like this is the example, like the classic. It's the doctor's time to go look at pictures of what happens at STD days or something like that. So let's go with Daryl Stingley here. Does anybody know who Daryl is? 5 people. So I felt bad because, like we've said several times, most of the stuff that's used for like trending top, like this malware search poisoning, are pop culture stuff. And we look at the list of these things. I'm like, I don't know who any of these people are. One of them ended up being like an LPGA player, and this guy apparently took the hardest hit ever in the NFL. And being a computer nerd / hacker type, I don't really know what the NFL is. So this actually happened on Tuesday. We wanted to show you a more recent example. So if you were to put his name into Google, you'd get a site that redirects you that installs malware that does this. And it's pretty well documented that it's malware. And if you notice, for Freedom's open source advocates, ClamAV does not catch this. So, no. So you take that same term and go over to Twitter. You'll notice there will be a whole lot of people there's a whole lot of links or discussion about them, and there's a lot of different URLs, but they all take you to the same kind of site at YouTube. And if you notice over on the right hand side, they use this video of Daryl to promote Lindsay Lohan porn, which although I'm not happy with, it's better than the Justin Bieber stuff we find. So they even get clever about this, and they'll embed these videos, and they'll put overlays over the videos. And this one says, due to copyright in YouTube terms of service, we can't upload the whole video. Here, go to this website and get it instead. And apparently, people follow this stuff, and you'll get pwned. So in our last example, we have 3 different accounts talking about 3 different trending topics with 3 different URLs, but when you follow them all, they all lead you to a .cn site. And as everybody knows, you don't click on anything in .cn. And if you do, bad things happen. So, without further.
Got it. So, a couple of the other examples that David was just showing were, some on Google, some on Twitter. What's interesting, the relationship between the different ones. You saw an attack going from Google to YouTube, from Twitter to YouTube, and really the interrelations that are happening. People using these terms to take you to a malicious site, people using these terms to take you to a spam site, also using it to poison YouTube clips and to get them up, whether they be porn or otherwise. So, as we saw earlier, over the snapshot that we examined, only 1% of the results were to Twitter. But, we talked about kind of why that was, because of the lack of actual ranking, right? So, because we were really kind of going to it from the eyeballs of a user. If you come online and you search for a term, you get top search results. So that's all we examined. We looked at the top search results. And in Twitter, if you're an attacker trying to reach eyeballs, it's actually a little inefficient for you. It's a little inefficient because you don't have that opportunity to make your stuff go higher in the ranking. So when it comes to Twitter, we want to take a look a little bit closer at what actually is going on. Even though from a viewpoint of a random user clicking, your chances are a little bit lower. What else is taking place in that network? And so we spent some time looking at the different characteristics and types of Twitter accounts. We spent some time looking at if we connect to the Twitter stream, and we did this from 2 standpoints. One was through the streaming API and getting a view of kind of almost real-time a sample of all the tweets that are happening. The other is through kind of whitelisted API key access, being able to come back and query accounts to ask for particular information. And so what we're able to see is, for any particular account, how many times they've tweeted, how many people are following them, how many people they're following. I mean, you think about Twitter, there's really only 3 things that you can do. And so that's really your feature space. I mean, you can also look at someone's profile. You can also look, as we just did, the actual URLs that are in the tweets. But we want to really understand kind of what's the behavior, how are legitimate users using this network, and then kind of how are illegitimate users using it. And is there an opportunity to build out reputation? Is there an opportunity to, based on that behavior, actually separate out this set and build out user reputation? Right, so there's certainly a fair amount of work on doing kind of content-based classification. But if you think about like what happened in the email world, everybody was doing kind of content-based classification, everybody was doing Bayesian, everybody was doing regexes and so forth, and then kind of the world looked up and realized, wait a second, there's a small set of good senders, and then there's this big set of bad guys. So we can actually use the reputation or the behavior of this particular IP address to classify them and make a decision before I accept their mail. So, in my mind, that's kind of the thing that saved email. I mean, it got us 95, 99% catch rates. And so kind of one of our goals here is to understand, is there the potential for the same type of classification for social networks? To be able to take those users and without looking at their profile, without waiting to look at the content that they posted, be able to build some user reputation and classify them. So when we dug into the different networks, if you dug into Twitter, it's a great example because the API is so open. It gives us the ability to easily ask questions, but on the other side also gives the attackers the ability to kind of also easily create lots of accounts and also easily inject lots of content for very low cost in terms of computing and bandwidth. So one of the things that we looked at, when we have about a little over 25 million Twitter accounts that we've analyzed. So you think about the whole set of over 100 million Twitter accounts that exist. We have access to over 25 million of those that we've examined. So, a pretty substantial sample or subset of the Twitter universe. So after looking at that, one of the things one of the first questions that we wanted to ask was kind of what's an actual Twitter user? What's a true Twitter user? Who uses Twitter in here? I probably should ask who doesn't. So most people. So now let's see if the people in this room are true Twitter users or not. And we set the bar pretty low. We say, hey, a true Twitter user is somebody that has sent at least 10 tweets, they have at least 10 people following them, and they're following at least 10 people. It's a pretty low bar for you guys that have actually used the network. But what we saw is only 29% of the accounts on the network meet that criteria. So if you think about it, 71% of the accounts on Twitter really aren't using it. So, that was kind of this first thing that we noticed. I mean, the vast majority of the network is not using it. If you look at it a little more closely, I mean, what we saw is if you look at how many followers each account has. The point here is, 16% of the accounts have no followers. So you think about that. Basically, 1 in every 6 accounts that's on the network, nobody's listening to them, right? If you think about it, over half of the network, 52% of the network have less than 5 followers. So a couple people are listening, but not many people care, right? But, it's interesting, only 9% of the network has over 100 followers. So the very kind of small set of the overall population that kind of people are kind of tuning into and listening to what they're saying. So that's kind of one feature.
So what's funny is it seems like that Twitter's become high school again. That you have your cliques of people that know like 5 people. Then there's people that everybody know.
Exactly. So what happens is that looks at kind of who's following. The thing we looked at next is how many people are you following. And so the point here again, out of all the accounts that are on Twitter, 19% of them aren't following anybody. They went on, they created an account, and they don't care to listen to anyone. So 1 in 5 accounts following nobody. There's only 10% of the accounts that are following more than 100 people. It's only 10% of the people that are listening to a stream that's kind of interesting enough to kind of actually pay attention around the clock. The next thing we looked at was kind of more interesting, the relationship between those two numbers. If you think of a normal social network, you're kind of following the same number of people that are following you. You think about Facebook, MySpace, it's a mutual relationship. It's kind of a two-way connection. Where in Twitter, you have this opportunity to have it one way. And so what we saw is that 55% of the network is actually using it with a kind of almost a two-way graph where they have roughly the same number of people following them as they're following. We plus or minus 5 is the criteria window that we use. So 55% of the network is kind of using it like a normal social network. What we saw is that 13% have more followers than they have people they're following. The other side is 32% of the network is following more people. So it really shows that about half the network are using it like friends. There's about 13% that are celebrities. And then there's about 30% that are consumers of content. So one thing we want to look at was, okay, how many of these are real accounts? How many of these are legitimate people and legitimate accounts? So we look to examine this thing that we call the Twitter crime rate. And the Twitter crime rate is the percent of accounts every month that are created and then suspended. And these are suspended by Twitter. So these obviously aren't all the accounts that are doing things that are malicious, but at least a measure of over time, how many accounts were created, doing malicious or misuse, and then kicked off the network. So if you look back since the beginning of the network, so this top left view is a view of since the beginning of the network, the growth of the network. So this is the user growth of Twitter since 2006. You know, one of the interesting things that we saw is there's this red carpet era. If you look at from November of 08 to April of 09, what happened is, you know, all the celebrities came. So if you look at the top 100 people on Twitter today, 50% of them joined in the same 6-month period. So, you know, the Ashton Kutchers, the Kim Kardashians, the Diddy's, all of the world, all joined in this 6-month period. If you look at what it did to the growth rate of Twitter, it went from 2% to 20% a month in that 6-month period. So what happened there, as we know, kind of where the users go, the attackers go. So this looks at the Twitter crime rate since the beginning of the network. So since 2006, when the network first started, there was 1% of the accounts that were created any given month that were suspended or kicked off by Twitter. You look at 2007, it went up to 1.7%. You know, 2008 went to 2.2%. In the middle of this red carpet era, it increased 60% to 3%. But 4 months later, the crime rate jumped to 12%. Right? So 1 in every 8 accounts that were created on this network were being kicked off. And again, these are only the ones that were being found. So it kind of simmered back down as the user growth simmered down. And so if you look at what we've seen so far this year, there's basically, it's gone from 2% to 1% and fluctuated in that range. So the average this year is 1.6% of the accounts that are created in any given month are being kicked off for misuse or inappropriate activities. And again, these are only the ones that are identified successfully. So we want to understand that better, kind of what are the behaviors and properties of these types of accounts. So one of the things that we looked at is we look back at this friend-follower delta. This friend-follower delta, remember, was kind of the difference between the number of people you follow and how many people are following you. And the thing that we notice here is that the attackers are using pretty aggressive kind of recruitment activity to get a higher number of followers. And so their delta is higher. So what you see here in the green space is the delta for legitimate accounts. So on either side, people that have more followers and people that have more friends. But for the suspended accounts, you see a much higher delta because either they've successfully created a higher number of followers or they're still in the process of following people so those people can follow them back. And so they have a higher number of friends. And so it's a pretty interesting attribute to use to get some separation. The other thing that we looked at to get some separation is this number that we call the tweet number. And the tweet number is pretty simple math. It's how many days have you been on the network? And we divide by how many tweets you've sent. So it's basically, on average, how many tweets have you sent since you joined Twitter? And so, for example, you know, my tweet number happens to be like 1.8. And, you know, I think Dave's is like, what, 3? 3.2. So it's interesting. I know some friends, a couple of you guys in the room, whose tweet number is 40. You know, 40. So you're like tweeting like every 15 minutes in a workday. And, you know, I'm like, wow, that's pretty high. You're kind of annoying, right? But then there are some, you know, other accounts, if you look on this, that are actually tweeting 100 times a day. You think 100 times a day, but it's only, you know, 0.19% of the population. So, you know, it seems like, okay, it's only a small number of people, 0.19% of the population. But what happens if you think of that 0.19% of 50 million users, you're talking about a couple 100,000 users. Now, you talk about a couple 100,000 users tweeting at least 100 times a day, you're talking about, you know, 19 million tweets out of 50 million. You're talking about 38% of all of the traffic on Twitter. So over a third of the traffic on Twitter being generated by this 0.19% of the population. So we thought this was pretty interesting attribute. So what we did from there is kind of really looked into how can we begin to build some level of reputation by coupling these features together. Coupling together this friend-follower delta along with this tweet number. And as we did it, we got some interesting separation or interesting clusters of user types. So I think David will step us through a few of those.
So this is a friend-follower delta on the positive side, which means that there's generally a lot more people following them than they're following. And, you know, the usual suspects are there, Fox News. It's funny to note that number 3, number 4, and number 5 are that Bieber kid. And, you know, at least Miley Cyrus makes it on the top list there. So when you go from, you know, the friend-follower delta, you know, like 119,000 down to like, in the 4,000, 5,000 range, you get people like I Skeet then tweet.